Dr. Spencer Thomas. We also have a wonderful panel of experts joining us, who I'll fully introduce ahead of the panel discussion. To give you a bit of a sense of how the event will run, I'll quickly take you through the agenda. First, we'll have opening remarks by the CDM chair. Then the vice chair will give a presentation about the history and impact of the CDM. After this, we'll move into a panel discussion. I'll introduce our panelists and then hand over to the chair, who will lead the discussion with them. Once our panel discussion wraps up, there will be an opportunity for you as our audience to ask questions. And finally, the chair will close the session with some final remarks. So before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. We have 90 minutes, and I'll try to keep us to time. We will get a 10-minute warning from the crew here in the room. And when you're exiting later today, please use the door just here. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to the chair, Lambert, for his opening remarks. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jana. Also, a warm welcome from my side. I'm this year the chair of the CDM Executive Board. So we will bring you on a journey about the clean development mechanism, what has happened in the history. It's a pioneering carbon crediting mechanism that has definitely left a mark in the landscape of environmental mitigation. I think the CDM stands out as the largest carbon crediting mechanism that we have to date, with more than 2 billion CRs being issued, more than 8,000 projects being registered. And we have a lot of lessons learned from this extensive experience, and we want to discuss how methodologies, institutional arrangements of the CDM can serve as a blueprint for other carbon crediting mechanisms. With a history spanning 2 decades, the CDM has an unmatched track record amongst carbon crediting mechanisms for mitigation. It was established early on, then operated, scaled up, and it was refined several times over time to improve it. So it was a continuous learning process which has equipped us with a lot of knowledge and a lot of documents. This experience extends beyond the CDM. We have a lot of independent carbon crediting mechanisms that were influenced by the CDM, and we also have jurisdictions who have drawn upon elements from the CDM. And then, of course, we have the multilateral process. We have the Paris Agreement with a new Article 6.4 mechanism, which is poised to become operational in the next year, and which will and is already also being influenced by the CDM. As we engage in today's discussions, we would like to highlight the CDM's wealth of experience that can be harnessed, bringing together perspectives from a range of different experts, which you have here on the podium, from designated national authorities to designated operational entities, academia, and project developers. So maybe just a few numbers to give you a glimpse. In terms of methodologies, we've developed 224 methodologies, and more than 500 methodologies have been proposed, and we had numerous requests for revisions and consolidations. We have issued more than 2 billion CRs. The number right now is even 2.4 billion CRs, with 12,000 successful issuances. We also have an institutional framework with more than 100 DNAs, 30 DOEs, 77 accreditations over time, and we just completed our 120th meeting of the CDM Executive Board, and we have a count of 280 gatherings of various panels and working groups. So it was definitely a very intense time where we have been working on the CDM so far. Let us now explore how lessons learned from the CDM can guide the evolution of future carbon crediting mechanisms. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to engaging in our discussion today.
Thank you, Lambert, for setting the scene for our event today. I would like to hand over now to our Vice Chair, Dr. Spencer Thomas, to deliver a presentation on a short history of the CDM. Thank you. Vice Chair, over to you. Yeah, you could stay there, yeah. Or you could...
Going to flip the slides?
Yes, we're just adding the slides now.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you, Chairman, for this opportunity to say a few words on the history of the CDM. Of course, the history is over 20 years now. The first meeting of the Executive Board took place way back in 2001, and we just heard from the Chair that we had our 120th meeting. From 2001, I think the Secretariat, with the help of the Secretariat, the Met panel and the AP was also established, and the other organizations within the CDM. And by 2003, we had our first project registered, as indicated in the slide.
Please change.
Where is slide? Who's changing the slide? Okay. All right. Thank you. So we had our first project registered in 2003. And of course, it took a few years. We got 1,000 project approved by 2008. Again, critically, the RCC, the first one was opened in 2012. I think we have 5 to date. And as indicated already by Chairman, we have 2 billion CERs issued. And again, in 2021 is the start of the temporary measures. So that gives a sense of what happened over the last 20 years, starting from 2001, when the establishment of the first meeting of the EB and the 120th meeting of the EB, which had happened before this meeting. So this is really a good history over the last 20 years. The next slide will speak to the areas, the sectoral scope, and where the 222 methodologies were concentrated. And you will see from the slide that energy took a bulk of those methodologies, and it was a lot of scope in terms of the various sectors. There are many sectors here, energy being critical, transport, construction. So methodologies were in all those sectors, and there were small-scale methodologies, large-scale methodologies, and consolidated methodologies over the last 20 years, 222 methodologies. The next slide speaks quickly to the registration of POAs and PAs. And again, you will see a very big spike in 2012, and that was as a result of the EU ETS change in their regulations with respect to registering projects which are non-LDC or not being able to be registered. So this is a spike. You could see over the years the relationship as we go forward, and we could see the tailoring off of the demand as we go forward. That gives a sense of the history of the POA and PAs over the last 20 years. The next slide will speak to the issuance, and again you see a similar pattern in 2020, 2011 and 2012. You will see again, and that is maybe related to the cross in the price of the carbon at that point in time, and also relating to uncertainty in the market. And this is basically historically how we move over the last 20 years or so. The next slide will speak to the trends and the key facts in the CDM. The number of POAs registered, we have already dealt with that. We now have 5 RCCs operating in various parts of the globe. Over 300 billion US invested in climate and sustainable development projects. Again, is a highlight of the work of the CDM over the last years. Of course, and we have recognized that the CDM was designed to do additional emissions reduction and also raising ambition over time. And also to contribute to sustainable development. I want to conclude by just making a few issues with respect to the next slide, please. Okay, there is not a next slide. Just to conclude by just identifying a few areas where we think that some lessons might be learned and we'll be hear from the presenters as we go forward. But we believe that in certain areas of governance and the governance structure, that has been something that we could look forward to having to replicate in other areas. Transparency provisions will also be clearly validation and verification processes. I think that is another area which you will hear about. The accreditation process that the CDM has elucidated over the last few years, and the rules and regulations with respect to project cycle development. These are all issues that, again, we will have to be going forward with. Issues of additionality, issues of double counting, issues relating to quantifying emissions reductions, addressing non-permanence, and of course, ensuring that we have socioeconomic safeguards and to ensure that the environmental integrity is key. I think these are some of the lessons that we have learned, some of the pitfalls that have been avoided and should be avoided as we go forward in these areas will be critical as we go forward. So we believe that over the last 20 years, that the CDM has made a significant contribution to the literature and to ensure that other similarly market issues will be profiting from what has happened in the CDM. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Chair, for that very informative recap of the CDM history. We'll now move to our panel discussion. Before we go ahead, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So first off, we have Dr. Kavi Singh. Kavi is the founder and managing director of Earthhood, a leading carbon offset verifier with accreditation under numerous standards, including the CDM and other leading carbon standards and registries. He currently serves as the president of the International Carbon Auditor Forum and is a member of the expert committee of the International Carbon Verification and Certification Management Institute, the International Carbon Auditor Forum, and the Vera Expert Committee. Next, we have Ms. Olivia Tuchten. Olivia is a principal climate change advisor at Prometheum Carbon. She's a multidisciplinary, Prometheum Carbon is a multidisciplinary team of independent and passionate carbon and climate change advisors based in South Africa. Olivia has worked in the carbon sector for close to 15 years on projects including assistance in the validation and verification activities associated with the CDM and the VCS, as well as the development of a new carbon program based in South Africa. In her personal capacity, Olivia is on the UNFCCC's roster of nominated experts and also on the Article 6.4 mechanism roster of experts as a methodologies expert. Next, we have Dr. Diana Harutyunyan. Dr. Diana has been involved in managing climate change and energy efficiency projects in Armenia since 1999 and has been managing the UNDP climate change program since 2005 under the Ministry of Environment in Armenia. As a consultant of the DNA of Armenia under the Kyoto Protocol, she assisted in formulation of a regulatory framework supporting CDM projects and their portfolio formulation. She's been a member, an alternate member of the CDM Executive Board under the Kyoto Protocol since 2008. She is also a UNFCCC expert on in-depth reviews of the national communications of Annex 1 countries since 2009. And beside her, we have Ms. Juliana Kessler. Juliana is a research associate at Perspectives Climate Research, mainly focusing on the design and development of national and international market-based instruments. She has looked at the robust operationalization of carbon market requirements for multiple research projects, thereby building on lessons learned from the CDM. She is currently managing an initiative that looks at the transition of CDM methodologies to the Article 6.4 mechanism. And that's our panel. So without further ado, I'll hand over to the chair now to lead this discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Jana. It's a pleasure to have you all here, so thank you for coming. And to start off, we would do a short round where you can present briefly, maybe 2-3 minutes maximum, your perspective. And so, Kaji, I would like to start with you. Why don't you start? You have the floor, please. And go close to the mic, if possible, because I think at least here it's... Yeah. So you have slides?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you handle the slides, please? Yeah, sure.
Thank you, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So CDM experience, it's a long history, and just to give you a perspective how much I know CDM, I did my first carbon offset project in 2007. And you like it or not, I'm still doing CDM carbon offset audits as a DOE or in personal capacity as a team lead as well. So there are obviously so much good things about CDM. So I would just like to give you the VVB perspective or the DOE perspective, which we call in CDM, because the voluntary market, the DOE became the validation and verification body. So, right, so this is the history. It all started with the Kyoto Protocol. The first project, I think, got registered in 2005. And then 2012, there was a peak. One of my fellow speakers was giving you the insight that how many registrations we have and what was the cycle, when did we have the maximum one. So 2012, everybody was trying to get a project registered under CDM without even having so much of assurance what would be the future of these projects. But yes, there was a big registration spike that happened. But then obviously the project started not going away for the verifications, and it started going down. There started the new voluntary market. Obviously, Vera and Gold Standard were some of the initial registries which started coming up. And I remember doing my first project in 2008 because initially the voluntary credits were happening because they were not able to get the retroactive credits of the registered CDM project. So I think that was the beginning for the people who got the project registered, but United Nations or UNFCCC were not giving them this flexibility that you can get the retroactive credits after, I think, 2007 or 2008. So this is where the voluntary market started picking in, and precisely they have taken everything from the CDM. My job as an auditor was just to make sure that the project was installed at a particular date, and then everything else was in the CDM validation and verification reports. So now this is interesting. So in order to explain what is CDM, I think I should compare it with the game of cricket. And I'm sure some of you would not know the complexities in cricket, but just to give you a perspective, I think this is the only game or the sports in the world which finishes in 5 days. And you are still not sure who is going to win. And there is a possibility even after 5 days, nobody is a winner. So the first thing is the standard, which is the UNFCCC, which is or CDM EB, preparing and setting up the standards. Then comes the host country, and then you need the letter of approval by the host country. And I think in the Article 6.4 as well, we would have the same kind of mechanism where you need a letter of approval. And then sectoral scopes. So there are 16 different sectoral scopes, starting from renewable energy to carbon capture and storage. Then comes the project activity or program of activities. So in some of the voluntary credits, they said, no, we are going to do something different than what CDM did. So we would rather call the program of activities as a group activity, but it's nothing fundamentally different, but a program of activities. Then crediting period. Crediting period is something you are entitled to claim the carbon offsets. In some cases, it's 7 years. In some cases, it can be renewed or it can be fixed for 10 years. Then comes the stakeholder consultation. So when we talk about the CDM experience into the voluntary carbon market, obviously you have to propose something new, which is not fundamentally part of the CDM. So some of the voluntary standards and program started focusing more on the stakeholder consultations. So that's a kind of add-on. And then emission reduction or GHG removal, it's pretty much the same. Methodologies, Dr. Limber talked about that we have more than 280 methodologies. So in my personal opinion, I think these voluntary programs only started developing their methodologies a couple of years ago. Before that, it was purely the CDM methodologies which were accepted by all the programs and standard. And just imagine a situation that you have a registry and you are not having any methodology. And this is the situation, because right now there are more than 30 different programs and registries which are available in different countries, different geographical locations, mostly voluntary. And most of these people are trying to develop their own methodologies just trying to address the questions, the fundamental questions of the CDM. Now, these are some of the things which I believe what CDM has already provided to the world and continue to provide even in the future. So methodologies, obviously, standards. So if you read the CDM standard and then compare with any other voluntary carbon market, more or less you are going to have pretty much the same fundamentals, but some additional aspects of it. Templates, I think until 2018 or 19, most of the voluntary programs using the CDM templates as such. As a VVB, even I was using the CDM EB templates, for example, validation report, verification report templates, and pretty much providing the same information to the voluntary programs. And skill set, obviously. How can you forget that? I would have not been standing here talking about CDM or the carbon market had it not been CDM. I started my career with CDM and continue to provide value addition to different programs and registries. Acceptance, I think there won't be too many carbon offset markets before the CDM came into existence. So obviously CDM created that business environment for the acceptance of carbon credits to the world and to the communities. And then just to give you a perspective, how many registries we have in the world now. And I think this would have not been possible without having the CDM and math panel and accreditation panel and so many other experts. Some of these experts are here in this room. So I mean, in my opinion, CDM has contributed partly or completely for all of these registries and programs which we have. Obviously, most of these registries and programs are voluntary, but then these registries and programs would have not been existing without having the experience of CDM. So that's very quickly on the existing scenarios. But yes, there are some questions which are still being discussed, even in the CDM projects until last year. The questions related to monitoring, questions related to baseline, and the most talking point is the additionality, especially for the renewable energy credits. So that is something we need to work on together when we are getting into Article 6.4. So thank you, and now over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that presentation and also the interesting comparison of cricket and the CDM. I haven't heard about that before, but also how much the CDM has influenced the voluntary carbon market, that it even reaches to the forms that the CDM has been using. That's also an interesting point. So if I'm not mistaken, Juliana is our next speaker. So we'll change the presentation. Juliana, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Lambert. So I will come in from the academia perspective and specifically from an initiative that aims to build on CDM methodologies to make them fit for the Paris Agreement. Thank you. Great. So just to provide a little bit of context, so CDM methodologies hold a lot of activity and sector-specific knowledge, and this should not just be discarded in our opinion. And we also have in the Article 6.4 RMPs, we have paragraph 5, which gives a mandate to the Article 6.4 supervisory body to review CDM baseline and monitoring methodology for applying them with revisions to Article 6.4 activities. And yeah, then also the review of the CDM Sustainable Development Tool and other tools. The Article 6.4 work plan for 2024 foresees that a first concept for this review or revision of CDM methodologies and tools happens throughout 2024, and a first concept shall already be ready for the next SB meeting, SB 10. So we should really strike the right balance by building on existing structures and lessons learned, while operationalizing stringent new requirements under Article 6 and ideally Article 6.4 requirements, which are more detailed and stringent. I will just quickly run through of these lessons learned, like specifically focusing upon additionality determination and the quantification of emission reductions. Obviously, there are other lessons learned, but going to focus on these two. As you know, there have been many different methods to determine additionality under the CDM. Regarding the barrier analysis, there has been a persistent information asymmetry, specifically between project developers on the one side and validators and the oversight body on the other, which proved difficult also when further guidelines for, let's say, more objective demonstration of barriers were implemented. So therefore, a lessons learned from our perspective would be that the barrier test is not the sole or a standalone test, so to say. For the investment analysis, so there were initially quite some issues as well, because a lot of gaming happened with default parameters, so to say, and then more guidance was provided on more stringent default parameters. So we would still consider the investment analysis as a cornerstone, but more guidance would need to be provided on conservative default parameters. Then actually the implementation of the E+ and E- policy rule under the CDM also resulted in some problematic interpretation, because some policies were not taken into account in the investment analysis. So a lessons learned from this would be that all policy instruments should ideally be taken into account. For the quantification of emission reductions, a main risk has been the overestimation of emission reductions and removals. So lessons learned would be to use conservative default values, to regularly update methodologies and to take into account new scientific findings, and also to systematically assess the overall uncertainty of mitigation outcomes and adapt the level of conservativeness accordingly. So, future applicability of CDM methodologies. We all know that methodology development is time intensive and also costly, and CDM methodologies also provide a well-known structure, so to say, and have been used across multiple crediting programs. So we would argue that it needs a revision of those elements that are not aligned with the new Article 6.4 methodological requirements. And here you see an overview. It's not entirely exhaustive of the new Article 6.4 requirements. So encouraging ambition over time, then crediting baselines have to be conservative, credible, and below business as usual. We have 3 specific baseline setting approaches, so best available technologies, then an ambitious benchmark approach, and also existing actual or historical emissions that are adjusted downwards. Then we need an alignment with the Paris Agreement's long-term temperature goal. That also means that not all activity types could just be credited in the future, but they actually need to avoid an emissions lock-in. And methodologies also need to align with the NDC, with the long-term low-emission development strategy of a host country, and the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement in general. And take into account policies and measures. And compared to the CDM, the definition of additionality now clearly refers that it needs to show that the activity would not have occurred without the mechanisms incentives. So the focus lies a little bit more on the incentives. So where does this leave us? You might know that the Article 6.4 supervisory body has, across the last 2 years now, developed the recommendation on methodologies and removals. It's going to be discussed at this COP. And they also plan to develop different methodology tools, baseline tools, suppressed demand tool, but also an additionality tool, a leakage tool, etc. And we would argue that CDM methodologies should be revised, and one approach is proposed by the Independent International Initiative for Development of Article 6 methodology tools. You can also find the link here on the slide. That has developed Article 6 tools that can then specifically be added up on those existing methodologies, so CDM methodologies, for example, and the idea would be to replace those passages of the CDM methodology that are not in line anymore with the new Article 6.4 requirements, and to replace them by the Article 6 tools. So we have then, replace certain section of the additionality determination by, for example, the additionality tool. Yes, and that was it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Juliana, for these insights also in the new requirements under the 6.4 mechanism and how they are different and compared to the CDM and your experience in updating and revising methodologies. So next we have Olivia. You also have a presentation, right? So let's try to change that.
Thank you, and thanks everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to Jana for the introduction. I'm from a climate advisory firm operating out of South Africa. I'm also here representing the Project Developer Forum, and that's an international association of project developers. We get together and meet regularly to discuss matters that concern carbon project developers, whether it's market-related concerns or methodology or carbon program-related concerns. That's how we get together and discuss positions and possible solutions. That being said, I can only really speak on behalf of South African project developers who we deal with. And just to give you a little bit of perspective of the carbon market in South Africa, we have a domestic carbon tax, which puts a tax on heavy polluters. Those heavy polluters are allowed to offset between 5 to 10% of their taxable emissions with carbon offsets. So that's created a rather nice, small, but functioning and thriving and growing carbon market. This carbon market really is underscored by CDM projects. The vast majority of the 37 projects and the nearly 15 million tons of carbon credits that have been listed on our South African registry are from the CDM. Obviously, there's been a slowdown in recent years due to the end of the CDM as it is and the end of the ability to issue CERs. But that being said, we expect that in the next phase, the CDM will be replaced by Article 6.4 projects. And as soon as that mechanism is operationalized, we really do expect to see a large number of projects coming through there, whether they transition or whether they're developed as new projects under there. We expect to see a large part of our domestic market being catered for by the CDM. And that in many ways is because there's been such an extensive period of development of the CDM. There's been so much rigor, especially in the development of methodologies and the other components that Kavi spoke of in terms of the standard, the tools, the templates, those kind of things. I do expect to see a continuation of the type of projects that are that have been registered under the CDM and could be registered under the Article 6.4 mechanism going forward. And in South Africa, much like the slide that the Vice Chair presented earlier, the majority of our projects are related to energy types of initiatives, whether it's renewable energy or energy efficiency. Makes a lot of sense in South Africa. As you may know, our national inventory is largely made up of emissions from our energy sector, which is heavily based on fossil fuel combustion to make electricity. So we've seen a range of projects, and more we're seeing smaller scale projects that do definitely qualify in terms of additionality. And I think really where the CDM has thrived and could be a learning point and stepping point for new carbon programs, new standards, is the rigor with which these methodologies are developed, with which they are assessed, approved, tested. I think that is really a fundamental stepping point for any new carbon program. The use of default values is contentious, and in many ways these are very broad, global, generic default values. They have been very useful, where project developers, especially in developing country contexts, lack the resources or the technical capabilities to do the type of research that's needed to develop very specific emission factors, for instance. These default factors have been hugely beneficial. I think that some of the default factors are meant to be generic and global, which is fine, but I do feel at the moment that there is a swing towards erring on the side of conservatism in order to address accuracy problems. And I believe that that's not the best approach. I think it will disadvantage many project developers, especially in developing country contexts, if that is the general trend. But that being said, I do think that the investment analysis tool is our go-to tool in terms of demonstrating additionality. It's very robust. I know that there are revisions coming to it, and perhaps there will be more in order to make it very, very robust. And I do appreciate that there's in the revisions that are coming, there is a drive to ensure that the assessment is more accurate, as opposed to just a blanket approach to making something more conservative. And certainly the annexure, where it contains these country default values, that's been hugely useful for our country contexts. Lesson learned, I think there have been some barriers in terms of the CDM methodologies in terms of developing projects, certainly from a South African perspective and maybe from a developing country perspective as well. There's a move to consolidate methodologies over time, to have one methodology that covers an enormous range of project types within perhaps a specific sector, whether it's a consolidated renewable energy methodology or consolidated waste methodology. And I can see the logic behind having all of these different elements pulled together in a central resource. But what we have found is that the consolidation makes these methodologies incredibly complex to navigate, not just from a project developer side, but from an auditor side as well, and maybe Kavi can speak to that. And what we find then is if there's increased complexity, means you have to have increased time and resources to navigate those complexities as a project developer, and the same on the auditor side. All of that means more costs. And we think that's a big barrier in terms of actually getting projects registered, is the complexity, the time and the cost of some of these methodologies. The last point is that I think it's important to maintain the level of integrity and confidence and scrutiny and rigor that the CDM has developed over the years in terms of approving these methodologies, and that I think should be taken forward.
Thank you very much. Also, in particular, your interesting insights in the complexity, conservativeness, and costs, and what it means, and the trade-offs that we clearly have there. Thank you. So last we have Diana. Do you have a presentation, or yeah, you speak? Okay, go ahead, Diana.
So it's interesting that I'm last speaker, and I would like to bring country perspective from DNA point of view. And being with the DNA from 2004, supporting in establishing the system, and also supporting for the project proponents to receive the letter of non-objection, I can say that, and also seeing that Armenia has 6 registered projects and some generated emission reductions which are also issued, and several more projects which were prepared but not registered. I want to bring here perspective of important teaching and capacity building expertise from the CDM process in the country for valuing the mitigation activities from different stakeholders, private sector, government, strong arms of the government, Ministry of Finance and Economy, understanding that mitigation can bring financial support, private sector activity, and not last, technology transfer. Where when you see that these technologies can bring economic benefits, but also can create some green solutions for the country, because when the projects have to be approved, the DNA has to sign the letter where it's saying that this project is in line with sustainable development goals. And we have a history of just signing these letters to understanding and using the it was guidelines or checking table that was developed to understand how to value the impact of the project, from opening green jobs or impacting the communities from this experience, improving the air quality, or understanding the fugitive emissions from gas system that is, in any case, is, for example, covered by the cost of the gas that the population is using. And if you are reducing the fugitive emissions from gas supply system, these funds can go in improving the and more rigorous taxing or price calculation for gas sold to the residents. So these all are from country perspective as create conditions that now is much easy for the developing mitigation projects, because these technologies and the methodologies which are used in CDM you can use for other instruments. Preparing projects for GCF or for JEF, you need appropriate methodological and calculating tools. So one important thing that we benefited as a country with less than 10 projects is the power grid emission factor standardized baseline, which was afterwards used as national standard for evaluation of all mitigation projects on energy efficiency and renewable energy. So twice Armenia applied for the Secretariat for supporting, checking and validating these grid emission factors, and this was used for valuing the mitigation projects and making them comparable and not overestimating the impact of these projects from the point of view of emission reduction. But now, as distinguished panelists raised a lot of issues related to the use of the same methodologies and instruments and lessons from CDM projects to the Article 6 project, looking from perspective of the country, the critical importance is that overestimation of emissions will not benefit the host countries. And here is very important the rigorous international system on, because as we know the rules for Article 6.4, it's the projects which have to be authorized must be out of NDC target. And if there will be overestimated and not properly authorization for this project will be given, this afterwards can penalize the country, because we in CDM also listened a lot of times that these are low-hanging fruits are used for CDM. If this will be case for Article 6.4, this will be not in benefit for host countries, and these have to be considered by international instruments that have to safeguard that the integrity from point of host country which are less prepared for such instruments, and this authorization will not penalize the authorizing body, DNA, of the Article 6.4 in the future to be criticized from the professional and NGO side, and also from the environmental integrity point of view. So I mean, another issue is that this authorization have to be, the capacity of the DNAs have to be enhanced for not risking that this authorization will be without appropriate understanding of the process in the country. And as I know that the supervisory body takes seriously also the safeguards, sustainability safeguards that have to be considered. And here will come important how is the professional community must be controlled with the watchdogs from the social NGOs, professional NGOs, which can supervise also from, not supervise as a legally, but also supporting that as CDM also was several critical issues were raised by the international NGOs, that these have to be in place also for Article 6.4, I think. So here it's value that our colleagues mentioned, like methodologies. I would like to mention here the technology transfer, and I would like to a bit also from country perspective say that not only investment analysis can prove additionality, because in developing countries sometimes policies are written as mandatory requirements, but they are not mandatory implemented. So that's why the barrier analysis also have to be taken in consideration, because the projects which will be implemented under Article 6.4 can open the road for reducing these barriers for future projects in the country. So the barrier analysis, I think, also can be considered as a serious additionality issue. Maybe with thank you for this opportunity to share from country perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Diana, for sharing that host country perspective. I found interesting, like the insights also, how it influences beyond the CDM and the different aspects you need to consider as a host country, and also what is the difference between the CDM and maybe the Article 6.4 emission reductions, how the situation will change. Okay, before we have a discussion with you as the audience, maybe a very short question to each of you. I think you have partially spoken to, but I want you to answer. So what is the one thing where you think, okay, this has the CDM done really, really good, and this can be taken over, no change necessary by other market mechanisms, the 6.4, but also non-governmental mechanisms? What is the one thing where you say, okay, here the CDM got it really good and right? And what is the one thing where you would say well, here other mechanisms should do it differently. That wasn't such a good idea what we did under the CDM. So maybe we go in the same sequence, and of course you can also speak to your specific topic. So Kavi, you are free to pick any point, but I would be very interested, like the accreditation system, how good is it, and also compared to other standards, and is it the one thing where you say, here we got it right, or maybe not?
So I wanted to say there are so many good things about CDM, not just one, but you reminded me the best thing what CDM has created, that's the accreditation system. Because the way CDM EB was accrediting the validation and verification bodies, the kind of quality checks we have, and number of checks, whether it's a regular surveillance, on-site assessment, pre-approvals, after approvals, I think that's phenomenal. And I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel for any other accreditation systems. But then, not just the accreditation, that's for the VVB side, it's also the methodologies, the way the math has been designed. I partly touched upon the math panel. So the kind of expertise what CDM EB has developed over the years in terms of different peoples with different backgrounds. So I think methodologies are definitely one of the pointers which are broadly sorted for the carbon offset world. But when I say methodology, there is also a concept of additionality, which everybody is pretty much talking about, and the biggest concern of the carbon offset community right now. So that needs to be probably reworked. I mean, Diana touched upon a very good example that the additionality at times is a concept of the different countries. I mean, you cannot have just one rule applicable to all. For example, if there are countries never had any CDM registered project, so if somebody is doing a CDM project in a particular country first time, or maybe Article 6.4, so we cannot have rules which are applicable to India or kind of a China GDP or economies. For example, the barriers to invest in that particular country. So I would say that's the only point which everybody is concerned and we need to work on. But broadly, there are more good things than the bad things, I would say, in CDM.
Okay, thank you. Juliana, what do you say?
I would say just the fact that methodological tools were developed under the CDM, so specifically like the additionality tools like tool 0.1 and 0.2. So I think that you had something that could be applied in multiple methodologies across multiple activity types. That was a great invention and also facilitated the methodology development in many different contexts. But still you would need to adjust a little bit what is in there.
And do you have also the one thing where you think, oh, this went really wrong, or this is the area where most improvement is needed?
I think for sure for suppressed demand now under Article 6, because in the end, if you apply it in the same manner as you did under the CDM, you would in the end also only hurt the host country. So that's something you need to take into account under Article 6 and really think about how you want to operationalize suppressed demand so that in the end, the host country doesn't overcredit.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. Olivia, what do you say?
I think one of the best things that the CDM has developed and that it should take forward, no questions asked, and everybody should take forward, is the concept and the approach to standardized baselines. Best thing since sliced bread, and those have worked, I think, in reducing the amount of effort and time that project developers need to develop their carbon programs and projects. The thing that I think has not worked so well is the consolidation and the complexity of the methodologies. I think I can understand why it was done, but I do think that an approach to make methodologies specific to technologies, possibly specific to country context, which is a bigger ask, I realize, but I think that has been a disadvantage to project developers.
Okay, interesting. And I think one of the features of Article 6.4 is that host countries can also play a greater role than they did under the CDM. Diana, what would you say?
I think
also
that
as a CDM executive board member for transparency.
No, I am thinking that the most important thing is bringing the private sector interested as an active member of promoting mitigation in the country. So, through this cooperation, the mitigation car has fuel. The fuel is money that CDM was generating. And I think that the private sector involvement in mitigation make the success of CDM, I think.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I can add. I can't resist to add my own thought. I mean, I share many thoughts that you said. I think one thing which hasn't been mentioned, interestingly, I think one of the biggest benefits is the capacity building the CDM has contributed in developing countries. Like that really many people in the private sector, in the public sector, were basically trained in how to quantify emission reductions, to identify the emission reductions in the first place, right?
Recognize them?
Yeah, to identify the mitigation options. That's the better word. Like sometimes people were not aware, like what are the emissions in my own country, and I think that was really a very positive element of the CDM. Just to add that. Okay, Spencer, do you want to add something to the debate?
Well, I want to agree with you on the issue of capacity building. I think it is critical. I think the establishment of the RCCs, again, was a novel idea, and I think it was a real great improvement to the process, because the issue of sustainable development, of course, and its impact and relationship with the CDM is also very critical, is one of the objectives, along with integrity in emissions reduction. So I think over the 20 years, the CDM would have at least achieved its objective of emissions reduction and contribution to sustainable development. And critical to that was the establishment of the RCCs, which provide a lot of support for capacity building and technology transfer also, relative technology transfer in that sector. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much to everybody. So I think with that, I turn over back to you, Ayana, and we can get some questions from the audience.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so if we can get a microphone, that would be great. So yeah, kick off with the Q&A. Just a few house rules. We'll take one question at a time. I think we have a fair amount of time for questions. Please, once you're selected, state your name and who you represent, your institution. And if you want to direct your question at a specific panel member, please indicate that, or otherwise, if you don't, we'll let any of the panelists decide to take the question. And just to say, we know that there might be a technical issue with asking questions virtually. So if those of you tuning in virtually, if you do have some burning questions to ask, there is a contact email on the side event info page where you can direct those questions. All right, so over to our first question.
So thank you very much, a great panel. I'm Asim Zia, professor in University of Vermont, and I direct Institute for Environmental Diplomacy and Security there. And I've been studying CDM over the years, and it was really great to see the historical context. And historically, one of the questions that I had was in terms of like the, of course, 2.5 billion tons emissions. That was great achievement. But in the larger context, when the CDM was conceived and designed to be implemented, there were like larger ambitions associated with this in terms of the bigger mitigation policy context. Like we have been like failing in terms of meeting our larger mitigation goals that are needed for meeting the Paris Agreement goals. So I was wondering, like, to what extent do you see that the project, the CDM, could have been more successful, and what were the factors that led to those failures? But also my other question was in terms of the transitions, like as under the Article 6.4, that as this mechanism is being sunsetted, do you think that the historic responsibility that was kind of embedded in the constitution of CDM, that it was a mechanism where and this is a question that's directly targeted for Spencer Thomas, the vice chair. The historic responsibility was that the international countries would transfer wealth because of the historic responsibility of their and environmental climate justice issues associated between North-South discussions that were happening prior to the Kyoto Protocol. The idea was that benefit transfer would be, this clean development mechanism would enable developed countries to transfer like their historic responsibility, offset that by promoting clean development in the developing countries and help them leapfrog into renewable, clean development or sustainable development feature. So there was also like alignment question between SDGs and CDM that was great, brought on. But I think that to what extent that CDM has been, once CDM is sunsetted, I'm not sure whether carbon markets will be able to fulfill that historic responsibility that was embedded in the Kyoto Protocol, and to what extent that would be kind of like a failure of policy, mitigation policy, in terms of moving us forward to implement the Paris Agreement targets. Thank you very much. I really appreciate this.
Thank you. And one part of that question was directed at Vice Chair Spencer, so maybe I'll let you take that.
Well, thank you for the question. I think that the issue of environmental integrity, as I said, is key. And I believe that the relationship with the SDGs and the CDM has indicated the alignment. Maybe a lot more could be done on this area. I think it is important that we look at the socio-economic and socio-environmental safeguards. I think that's something that we might want to look closer at. It's one of the areas which I believe we could do much more. And I think critically important will be the issue of capacity in the South and ensuring that capacity building is targeted properly and effectively so that more involvement in the CDM from the South will be, and some of the marginalized countries will be facilitated. So I don't have a better answer for this in terms of the historical responsibility and what the CDM has done in that area, but I believe that going forward, we need to up the ante with respect to capacity building and strengthening the institutions within the South to handle this issue of market development. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have another question?
Or maybe I come back also to the question of success to give my personal perspective. I think what's really key and what has shown maybe the CDM to some degree, but also other carbon crediting mechanisms beyond the CDM, is that I think integrity is really key to have trust in a mechanism and to create demand, right? And so you observe that with different mechanisms. We had the avoided deforestation debate with Vera. We had someone mentioned the non-additionality criticism to some CDM projects, etc. So I think it's really important for any mechanism to really maintain integrity as a prerequisite to get scale in the end, right? And to be successful. That's my personal perspective on that point. Thank you.
May I add just on personal opinion on the shortage of the envisaged carbon credit projects and issuances that have occurred? I think that the adequate pricing of carbon is a real barrier, especially in a developing country context where we pay auditors in euros and rands, and these things can get very, very expensive, which I'm sure it's well worth it. I know it's well worth it. It's just that when your demand and the price of carbon is so low, it doesn't really make economic sense. So there really needs to be an adjustment in the price of carbon.
That's a good point.
To have a just high price, there must be market demand. And for market demand, there is need political will and enough demand-creating countries. Coming to your question about historical responsibility. So the demand was reduced, the price go down, and this because this is market mechanism, and so regulation is coming from policy, and this was the as Spencer brought this diagram, this peak of shows the political change result. So, of course, there was effort done by the CDM EB to put the rule for cancellation, and this gives opportunity for cancelling the CRs, which can create a situation with positive from point of environmental integrity, but this will need also recognition of this cancellation against some green value given to any cancelling entity, which was not so successful, I think. But in any case, cancellation of CDM's registered CRs was the way out with this reduced price of the CDM, which can be yet considered in the future also as an opportunity for existing CRs which are registered by till 2020.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, seeing no other questions, I think this brings our Q&A to a close. I will hand back over to Lambert for his closing remarks.
Thank you, colleagues, for coming. Thank you to the panelists. I think we had some interesting points from the presentation and also from the discussion. I think it's very clear that the CDM, it was the biggest mechanism that we had so far, the biggest crediting mechanism in the world, and it has created a lot of wealth of experience, and I think it will clearly influence a lot whatever will come, both under the 6.4 mechanism as well as under other carbon crediting mechanisms. And with that, I thank you very much and wish you a very nice evening. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
One question, these presentations will be available?
I think so. Please, Secretary, if you could help me, yes? Okay. Thank you.